Welcome to the next episode of the Business Karaoke podcast. Today we have a very special guest and his name is Akio Fujii. Now, before we get into what Akio's done and why I thought he'd be a really great guest, Akio is a very special friend to me because he's my first LinkedIn friend. I've never made really a friend on LinkedIn before, and Akio is my very first LinkedIn friend. I first came across his articles and his commentary when he would share really interesting articles and thoughts, not only about the Western view, but also a Japanese view on current topics. So Akio and I connected, and then over the last couple of weeks and months, we've learned more about each other and each other's work. And I thought this is the next perfect guest for the Business Karaoke podcast. So Akio, welcome to the Business Karaoke podcast.
Thanks for having me. That was an overwhelming introduction, Brittany. Thanks very much.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. So Akio, you're currently now, so before we just sort of jump into where you were born and that kind of stuff, because it's always very interesting to learn about where people came from, what people might not know about you is a little bit about kind of your work and the fact that, for example, you now specialize in M&A and turnarounds and things like that as an independent management consultant. Is that right? Do you want to share a little bit more about your current business for the listeners?
That's correct. Okay. Right now, I'm a self-employed management consultant specialized in the fields of mergers and acquisitions, post-merger integration, turnarounds, and new business development. It's kind of a mixture of strategic corporate transformations. As you can see, I have this distinctive accent. I was born in Kobe, but I was raised mostly overseas. I was raised in Australia and the United States. And with my career trajectory, 15 years have been spent with the financial institutions and finance-related consulting company, 12 years with entertainment, and 3 years just with consulting. So you could kind of image how old I am from that.
Right. So, but it also tells you, for all the listeners, it really sounds like just stay in there because there's going to be something in there for you. So what I'd love to know a little bit more about is that you said you were born in Kobe, and you were, but that was also where, and you were raised abroad. But when you and I first connected, you had a story for me about a particular babysitter that I found hilarious. And I just thought we have to begin the podcast like this. So can you tell us a little bit about your famous babysitter?
Well, he's not the popular political figure, so to speak, but Shinzo Abe used to work for my father. He used to work for Kobe Steel. My late father passed away like 4 years ago, but he was one of his direct subordinates. And Shinzo Abe used to babysit myself and my brother whenever my parent had industrial parties. So he came over to my place and we used to play games.
I love this so much, right? Because in Japan, why would you bother getting a babysitter if you have a team, right? You can just call on them and they can look after your kids, obviously. I love it. So Akio, one of the reasons why I thought it would be so great to have you on the podcast is that obviously we've heard a little bit about the Western Japanese view, but what I would also love to take this opportunity is to have that Japanese Western view. And actually you're one of these special people that can really do both. So what I would love to do is to get into a little bit about how you ended up here today. And I know we've had, we're going to go into sort of three main stories that that we wanted to share with the audience or with the listeners today, but maybe you can share a little bit about your career as such.
Being raised overseas, I regard my bilingual and bicultural skills to be my tools, not weapons, but tools. And when I think about my experiences with a financial background and being a principal business driver of projects when I was working for business companies, that itself are my weapons. So with a combination of those two, it was inevitable that I put myself in a cross-border projects. Right. That's where my value was. That was where people appreciated my presence. So I would have to say that, throughout my career, 30 plus so years, it's always been an intermediate between Japan and the Western culture. And what's so difficult about this is because, case by case, you become more of a Japanese than Westerners and vice versa. So there's no really a middle point. Throughout our conversations today, you might hear a portion of myself being so Japanese, a portion of myself being so Westerner, but it's something you cannot control. It's who you are. So it kind of sounds like an excuse, but it'd be great if you could, understand and listen what I have to say as those being the prerequisites.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I wanted to begin a conversation like the Business Karaoke podcast is because I wanted to hear these kinds of voices and these kinds of stories about, what it's like to not, people often talk about being biracial, bicultural, bilingual, whatever it is, that you kind of are half and half. Even the word for biracial in Japanese is hafu. And if we think about it, it's not really being half, it's you really have two. And I found my life, especially in Japan and Australia and having lived in other countries as well, is that it's less having one heart and then within that heart, parts of it are taken up by cities. It's really like you just get another one. I feel like I have a Japanese heart, I have a Western heart, and I have all these other hearts that I'm collecting along the way. So I love that. It's really your tools, not your weapons. So I would invite you to share a little bit about some topics that we had agreed to talk about today. So this is obviously Akio, and we're going to, for those listening, and we'll have this as a YouTube as well. So if you'd like to follow along with the video and you can see the imagery, then go ahead and follow along on YouTube. If not, you can go ahead and listen on via our podcast, and we'll have in the show notes, we'll have this PowerPoint presentation. But don't worry, you won't need to have the actual presentation in front of you to follow along, because we'll walk you through it. Okay, Akio, over to you. Let's start getting into it, shall we?
Okay. So this is purely my subjective view. It's based on my experience, but to start off with, just having Americans to be an iconic nationality from the Western world, a lot of my Americans see Japanese to be these 5 elements that I've listed here. One would say they're honest, obedient, humble, reticent, reliable. Now, this was pretty kind of challenging to list because there's not an exact word that would equal to that of Japanese. It's very kind of delicate how the meaning translates in the local language. So I've written down the Japanese translation for it as I understand it, with honest being shojiki, obedient being sunao or jujun, humble being kenkyo, reticent being kamoku, reliable being seijitsu. I intentionally didn't use the word modest because modest fit into various categories within these 5. And vice versa, a lot of my Japanese friends would see a stereotypical Americans to be honest, self-esteem, self-assert, instantaneous, and reliable. So you can see that within these 5, there are 3 elements that are really kind of contradictory to one another. For example, obedient would be opposite to that of self-esteem. Humble will be an opposite of self-assert. Reticent will be opposite to instantaneous. It's not exactly opposite, but they're not equal, for sure.
Right. It's a spectrum.
I see that these 3 elements often cause a lot of, conflicts
tension,
and whatnot.
Right.
Any questions so far with this?
No, right. Yeah, so definitely there's a lot of tension. So, but I also see that, you've listed that the Americans see the Japanese to be honest, and you see the Japanese also see the Americans as honest. I would even put forward that honesty has then a different lens. I've found the Japanese to see Western honesty as this kind of almost being selfish in a way. Like, you know, for example, if you wanted to go to a restaurant, you would say, no, I don't like the restaurant, or I don't want to go there. So this kind of being honest, I found sometimes isn't necessarily a good thing.
True. I guess that's going to be categorized as self-assert.
Right. Exactly.
It's kind of the mixture of a lot of components, but you know, it's the irritating portion of a nationality, but it's something that is understandable and perhaps sometimes enlightened if you really understand your opponent. So I thought it was kind of logically important that I approach this matter and say, you know, these two elements are opposing to one another, so that if you understand that, the approach to, you know, Americans' approach to Japanese and vice versa would be different than not understand this at all.
Right.
So, you know, there are cases where a lot of Japanese mistake Americans' criticism for scolding, and also many of them would mistake disagreements for fights. But that's not the case, because for the Americans, where people learn to debate with one another and refine their intelligence, you know, discussing and sharing their thoughts is a normal thing. But for the Japanese, it's all about harmony. So there's all these contradictions, and you really have to understand each other's culture in order to really deep dive into conversations and execute, you know, projects in a collaborative manner.
How would you recommend, for example, one of your clients coming to you and saying, okay, we are either developing a new relationship with a Japanese supplier, or we're looking to acquire a Japanese company, or we're being acquired by a Japanese company? How would you say these kinds of characteristics, these kinds of cultural characteristics sort of take or play out in the workplace? Because, you know, when we see something like honest, or we see something like self-esteem, I think we all have a certain understanding about what that might mean. But I think the face that it shows in the workplace can be quite different. So what would you say either to your Japanese counterparts working with foreigners, or the other way around, foreigners working with the Japanese? How would you kind of, what kind of guidance or what lens would you give them to look out for these characteristics in the workplace?
Brittany, that's an excellent question, by the way. Ultimately, both Japanese and Americans are often aiming for the same thing, but they just don't realize that. It's the approach that's different.
I love that. Tell us more. I love that.
This example might be interesting. You would have an American company hire an individual, and the employer would say to that employee, you have good ideas, and we hired you for a reason. Don't be afraid to speak up. Right. It's a typical American company. Your boss, your colleagues, they want to hear what you think. Right. So they make this atmosphere for you to be, for you to easily participate in discussions. It's a workplace with a positive atmosphere, and that, in fact, is also appreciated by the Japanese, but they rarely see that. You know, for Japanese, they would say that kind of environment to be kaze toshi ga ii shokuba desu ne. Kaze toshi ga ii meaning the space is well ventilated. It's a direct translation, by the way.
Yeah. So the air passes through.
That's right. That's right. So, you know, Japanese think it's ideal for people to speak out and exchange thoughts, yet they emphasize so much on the harmony that they rarely see that situation.
There's so much of this that I think will come alive in your stories. So if it's okay with you, I'd love if we can move on and we can get a little bit more into your story. So, and again, I think it's really important to just iterate that that we're not here to academically discuss or argue, cultures and things like that. What I found to be lacking really is real experience from people that are on the ground in both countries, or that are really these global people that can really speak well on both sides. I'm not looking for people that have lived in Japan for 20 years and they don't speak any Japanese and they don't have any regard for Japanese culture, or even the other way around. I'm really looking for these stories, for these best practices from people like you and this wider global community to share these stories. So you've also mentioned a little bit about the analogy of like a sprint versus a marathon. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. This COVID-19 outbreak kind of explains the situation, I guess, but Japanese tend to be very patient compared to the Westerners, and they tend to handle the situation with utmost endurance. They are well aware of pace distribution, so they could be. It's an analogy, I guess, but they're very good at marathon. It's marathon meaning not the actual marathon itself, but a long-term projects that requires months and months of executions. So, Japanese tend to plan before they run, but that's what they're good at. But to a lot of Westerners, that might be irritating because it's just too slow. They may think that the Japanese are too cautious. On the other hand, a lot of Westerners are really like a sprint, they're running a 100-meter short track. The explosive power to do things instantaneously, their essential detail to run and think at the same time. So, just comparing the two, it's so different because, again, one duly plans before they run, and one think and run at the same time.
Right. And what I love here about the sprint versus marathon analogy is that one is neither right or wrong. A sprint isn't better than a marathon, and a marathon isn't better than a sprint. They're just a completely different game. And what we've seen time and time again through Japanese and American, or let's say brackets, kind of Western collaboration, that we're actually playing two different games on the same field, right? Which is where these incredible, frustrating situations come from. The Japanese are looking to their American or their Western partners saying, how can you be so reckless? Or how can you make that decision like that? And on the other side, the Western partners are thinking, we don't have all day. By the time you've made a decision, the market's going to change, But funnily enough, but we'll get to this later in the talk. But we know that the majority of companies over 100 years old are Japanese companies. So the fact that we're playing different games on the same field just gives rise to so much conflict and tension. So I think just this understanding of, yes, we're both running, right? Somehow we're both running. The question is, are you running really fast or are you running really slow? And what I've seen time and time again is that if you can implement the sprint phase and also the marathon phase effectively, that's where you really start to be able to run a successful project, because you're not simply running, and then you're exhausted very quickly, or, the other way, which is you're not running a marathon and, you're miles behind. The ability to be able to sprint and then sustain is really important. So I'm looking forward to hearing how you've been able to bridge these kinds of two approaches. So
yeah, interesting you mentioned that, because turtles are comfortable speaking to other turtles, and rabbits are comfortable speaking to other rabbits.
That's right.
And it's the matter of turtles and rabbits doing the business together. So that would be difficult because the paces are different.
Right. So can you talk us through this next model that you have for us?
Okay. This is actually a cycle of business that Ray Dalio, the billionaire hedge fund manager, had wrote, illustrated on his famous book called Principles, my favorite book. It really talks about how the plan, do, check, and actions are implemented in such a way that here we have, number one, we set the goals and we evaluate what the problems are, and we consider the diagnosis for those problems, and we design how to move forward, and we execute the actions. So this cycle applies to any culture, wherever you may be. But again, being the marathon versus the sprint analogy, being effective towards working between Japan and the Western world, I see that this cycle is constantly moving with the Westerners, as opposed to the Japanese. They're kind of looking for the big picture, uncertain that each of the tactics will be effective or not. So, again, you would have to understand that the Japanese would have to be receptive towards the Western approach, and the Western people understanding the Japanese approach. But if you kind of understand the system of how they think, or how they would how they would need consensus upon going forward, I think this analogy would be quite useful.
I see this a lot, especially in our work in innovation, where we work in divergent and convergent sprints, in short sprints. And we show the double diamond, where we say, okay, you diverge and converge and diverge and then converge again. And very often with our Japanese clients is they say, okay, and then it's over, right? And we say, no, it's never ending. Actually, it's a cycle. And this idea that it's not linear, rather cyclic and iterative is a very new approach.
True. And it's not like Japanese is going to be opposing to everything Americans or other Westerners would say. But if they would understand the meaning of those step by step, then they'd be actually collaborating more and be participating to cooperate and actually execute the mutual goal. So it's really about duly discussing the matter among the Japanese as well as the Westerners, and meet consensus to go forward.
Right, and I find that one of the real challenges to consensus is this kind of fear in the Japanese that we have to make the right decision and you can never go back, right? And I've seen this time and time, and this is my experience. Again, we're not here to share this as gospel, rather that we're just speaking from our experience. And in my experience working in innovation in Japan, one of the biggest problems that we have to start is that when we do problem setting and the Japanese are thinking, what happens if this isn't the problem? And I say, well, the idea is we begin in problem exploration, we try to reframe it, and then we get data, and then that will tell us if we're on the right track or not. But the idea that we are merging into step two, that is, moving past the problem without being 100% sure if this is the right problem, is very uncomfortable. And in order to be able to kind of manage that I do think there's a lot of culture that comes into it. And again, there's no real right or wrong, but there is just different approaches. And I guess that we'll have to, or that we will learn also through your stories, but also as we go along, that not every approach works every time, and the ability for people like you and me that have these kinds of two toolkits is to use them when we can. So
That's another valid point, Brittany. Whenever Japanese think of problems, they would instantly think of responsibilities,
Exactly.
and they hate to take responsibilities, which is the reason why they move with harmony. But you have to eliminate that responsibility portion out of the equation and have them understand the nature of try and error.
Right.
A lot of them have many difficulties going over that impediment, but if they understand that responsibilities are not involved if and when problems arise, you know, that itself clears one obstacle. So that is a very important step going forward. And another thing that a lot of Westerners would have to recognize is that because they don't want to take responsibilities, a lot of Westerners may see Japanese to hide problems.
Right.
And that's where the thing gets ugly, because when you hide problems and you procrastinate those problems, then they tend to become bigger and bigger while they're hiding that problem.
Right. And the Western manager has their hands on their head saying, why didn't you say something earlier?
Right. But we go back to that story that, you know, if the Westerners would eliminate the fear of the Japanese facing responsibilities first,
right,
then they wouldn't have that, and they would be happy to disclose those problems.
Exactly. And I think when we talk about the Japanese hiding from responsibility, I just wanted to highlight for people that are listening to this that don't have experience with the Japanese culture. It's actually not because they're lazy. It's the opposite. It's this kind of overwhelming fear of kind of perfectionism of, can I do it right? And I'm not sure. So the idea of I don't want to say yes is because I don't know if I'll do it 100% properly. Whereas a Western person will say, you know, or let's even take an Australian example. We have a terrible saying in Australia called give it a go, right? Give it a go means like, what does it give it a go mean? It means like, just do your best. And if it doesn't work out, you know, at the end of the day, no one died, right? That's the Australian mindset. Whereas the Japanese are kind of walking in saying, if I can't do this and execute this perfectly, I'm not going to say yes in the first place. So this is kind of where we start highlighting that those original characteristics that we brought up at the beginning of the show, this is where we start recognizing how they actually play out in the workplace.
Totally agree. You know, it's funny how a lot of Japanese baseball players aim at least to exceed batting average of 300. And, you know,
is that a lot?
Major League Baseball, Major League Baseball players would just go out there and swing the bat, see what happens. And if it didn't work, they would go again, swing the bat, and just continue doing so. Right. But Japanese seek for such, you know, perfectionism that they practice until they're certain that they could exceed the batting average of 300.
Right. And this is something that I hope to see really in Japan, is this idea of how, you know, might we be able to, and I think there's both ways to learn here, really. I think that Westerners can really take more time and can take a little bit more pride in their work before they begin something. I think this idea of just give it a go, I think is sometimes detrimental. But I certainly think the other end, you know, is kind of, you know, prevents the Japanese from moving at all. So this is one of those moments that I really love to be able to use both of my toolkits. You know, what is it about my kind of Australian personality that I can kind of get going? But at the same time, what have I learned in Japan about being, you know, delivering a quality product and delivering a quality service? So you're going to share with us 3 cases today that you've worked on over your career. I know that this doesn't even scrape the surface of the kinds of stories and everything that you've seen, but we only have a limited amount of time together. So I wanted you to pick some, you know, 3 stories that you might be able to share. So one is about resolving USJ, so the Universal Studios Japan's traffic problem. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you ended up at USJ, not jumping on the next ride, but as somehow working out and trying to help them with their traffic problem?
Okay. So applying the analogy of marathon versus sprint, the ultimate goal was to resolve this traffic problem. And what it was Universal Studios Japan, USJ, it's located at the tip of Sakurajima Pier in Osaka, which is really facing the Bay of Osaka. And the most reasonable access for people to visit USJ was by using Hanshin Wangan Highway, which are the two arrows that you can see on the map. It goes all the way from Kobe, from Okayama side, down to Wakayama. So people from west and south, they would head for USJ, most probably utilizing that highway was kind of a reasonable, logical thing to prepare. But the city's environmental assessment calculated that there's going to be 7,500 vehicles visiting USJ a day, causing a massive traffic congestion on this Wangan Highway, because USJ was only designed to have 2,900 plus car parking space. You know,
and
you can easily imagine that. I'm sorry.
When was it designed? Because you know, with the almost 15 years I've been in Japan, it certainly had many more visitors than that. So do we have any kind of idea when the planning was?
The point in time I was seconded as an expat from Salma Bank, it was 1998. And it was really right about that time this assessment came out.
Okay.
So, you know, my biggest objective of going to USJ from the bank that was about to participate in the project finance was to resolve this issue so that the financial institutions forming a syndicate to execute this project finance be able to understand that the feasibility study that's been prepared are reasonable.
Right.
But when you have this problem that's been raised and being publicly announced by the city's, you know, assessment team, the financial institutions will be conservative and they'll, you know, think twice about executing this loan.
Yeah.
So this was a huge issue, and it was certainly a big marathon goal that we needed to accomplish among the 30 plus expats that were working for USJ at that time.
Wow. And what were your kind of guidelines? What did the bank kind of send you over with? What was your, you know, not only just your KPIs, but what were they really looking to do? What were the things that would have enabled you to say yes or no to a project?
You know, obviously you had to shift the people that were anticipated to come by their own vehicles to come by public transportation instead. So they needed to be bits and pieces of strategies that would be persuasive enough to accomplish that. And it's not just a matter of announcing to people, hey, USJ is located at this position, you know, this location. So we anticipate a traffic jam, don't come by car. That's not the thing, you know, that wasn't the way to go. So, you know, we needed a solid tactics to actually accomplish this, and it wasn't just one.
Okay, so maybe it's a simple question, but why wasn't it that easy? Why couldn't you just say, okay, everyone, come by train? Was it the relationship maybe with the transportation companies?
That too. Well, you know, people can go on a highway and they could see the sign that says there's going to be a traffic jam from here and onwards for such and such distance. At that time, we didn't have, you know, smartphones. Right. It was like late 1990s. We didn't have a smartphone. We didn't know the real-time traffic congestion level of Wangan Highway. Right. So we required a situation where people can have an option to go or decide a wise approach, a meaningful approach for them to actually use the public transportations.
Right. Okay. And then so if we move Can you talk to us a little about it? So you guys arrived there, you know, team of 30, ready to change. What's the next step? How does one begin?
So going back to the sprint issue, these are the things that the USJ members, mostly the Japanese nationals, discussed with the American counterparts working for Universal Studios Inc. In LA. We've decided to segregate our business partners in terms of ticketing. Okay. Now, normally, like the Oriental Land with their, Tokyo Disneyland, they've negotiated with travel agencies for a fair amount of marketing dependencies.
Sure, and commissions. There's a lot. Sure, and commissions as well. There's a lot of money being made on both sides from this collaboration.
That's right. So, Oriental Land, it was established by the Mitsui Group companies. They had transportation of their own. They had collateral to present to the financial institutions upon executing finance. So they didn't really think about the matters that USJ had to worry about. So they've discussed things with JTB, Kinki Nippon Tourist, Nihon travel agencies and whatnot. And, they've done their fair share of marketing exercises. But USJ, because we had to rely on public transportations, we've decided to weigh emphasis on our relationship with Japan Railways. And all these colorful JR logos that you see from on your screen is the each of the privatized companies that runs the regions of Japan Railways. From left, it's JR Kyushu, Shikoku, Nishinihon, which means the JR West. You have JR Tokai, the orange. You have JR East, you have JR Hokkaido, and on the very right is the JR system. It's the joint venture of the 6 JR companies. So we had weighted our negotiations with the JR group, and it was really important that you understand the hidden correlations in this group, because there's obviously one is superior than the other. We've negotiated the content, order, and who we're negotiating, their positions, and see through that our goal would be understood by the JR Group people, and they would proactively participate and cooperate to accomplish our goals. And one of the things that was really interesting was that JR system controlled the whole ticketing system for the nationwide railroad system. And so if you were to go to one of the JR stations and you visit their green windows and buy a ticket for your bullet train, the designated reserved seat will never overlap with another person, even if you buy the ticket at the very same time. They never overlap, right? That's the system they've accomplished. And it was a network that is really strong in terms of marketing. And we were very attracted to that infrastructure. Now, if you were to go to Tokyo Station and buy your bullet train ticket to Shin Osaka Station, you would go to JR East's station and buy the ticket, and you pay with your credit card or with your cash. But they've applied this managerial accounting system that each of the revenues will be determined, each of the group's companies' revenues will be determined based on the length of railroad ownership. So even the East would receive 100% of your, of your payments. They would divide that income by the group companies later on, is how they run. So considering the fact that USJ is based in Osaka, it would be a very profitable destination for JR Tokai, right? Because you have a group of people coming over to USJ from Tokyo, where it's highly populated, And most of the railroads within Tokyo and Shin Osaka is owned by JR Tokai. So they benefit the most from that transaction.
Absolutely.
So understanding that mechanism, it was wise to deal with one of USJ's shareholders, JR West, to collaborate together with JR Tokai first to persuade JR East, thus JR System at the end.
So let's get into that. Tell us how you do that, because that's where the really interesting stuff is. How do you manage that relationship?
JR Tokai was rival with JR East, so you don't want to have JR Tokai say straight to the face of JR East and say, we want to support USJ. You guys help us too. And JR East would say, no way.
Forget it. Yeah, forget it. Yeah.
Right? But if you would have JR East team up with JR Tokai first and nemawashi, which means to lobby with JR System, that we're all in this together, let's form a team to negotiate and persuade JR East, then
and that was your idea.
Would be, that's right.
That was, yes, I was going to say, this can't come internally. This idea is not an internal idea. You can't say that internally. No, but I'm saying you had to come in and introduce that idea, because when you're kind of in the mud, when you're JR East or when you're, JR Tokai, you can't possibly go and knock on the door. You really do need that external view to come in and say, hey, why don't we approach it in a different way?
Right. Just in case someone from JR Group sees this, this is my subjective view, by the way.
This is subjective. This is all subjective. And any mistakes
but it was a valuable insight for my universal counterparts in LA, because all they saw was these logos with different colors, and they couldn't understand.
Yeah, right, exactly. As a Westerner, you would look at this and I see 7 JRs. Obviously, I can read the kanji, but if you don't read kanji, you just see JR 7 times. You think, what's the problem?
Right, but if they would understand, listen to these insights and see the tactics of going forward. It's the local expertise as against to how the Westerners would perceive this and how they would be receptive to the idea to negotiating that order.
Right.
But it's very important that you do that. And it's really about duly communicating with your counterpart so that they would understand the situation here in Japan.
Exactly. So what was then the next step? You got everyone on board, everyone's on the same page.
Right. Now, again, because Japanese were so allergic to changes, we had to persuade my Japanese colleagues that this is about redesigning. It's about improving the previous plan, because we needed to persuade the financial institutions. So they got on board, and we're persuaded that the way we're handling things with our American counterparts in LA were reasonable. And so we went on and said, let's deep dive into this idea about collaborating with JR, but not having the travel agencies feel ignored. We needed to have travel agencies in the loop. So we needed to have some kind of a definition as to what they would want to emphasize, or what USJ wanted them to emphasize, more rather. So we've spoken to the JR team. Let's sell long distance travels together, right? It's about, for JR, it's about the distance that people travel to get to the destination. So we've only talked about how we get people to visit USJ using their transportation systems and travel long distance. But with travel agencies, that wasn't the case, because they don't own railroads, obviously. So we've negotiated with the travel agencies that USJ wants the consortium of travel agencies to emphasize their marketing on off-peak season visitations. For example, we would have the rainy season starting from June, July. That's the time of the year that the attendees drop. So we would want those seasons to be filled with people, and in order to do that, we needed the help from travel agencies. So, having that objectives in mind, we've let the travel agencies and the JRs to sell advanced tickets. And when I say advanced tickets, it's the tickets for the future dates. And so that the USJ, as you can see on the right-hand side, can manage the attendees per date. Right. I think this is the case with other universal theme parks around the world, but the passports are being reserved based on the date of visitations, unless you have annual passports and whatnot. So, people would plan ahead. This is the date I'm going to the theme park. They would visit those ticket, agencies and buy them. So, they'd be prepared. And along the way, travel agencies would want to sell, airplane tickets or the train tickets and the accommodations to go with it. They would emphasize on the volume and the off-peak season so that they can receive high incentives from USJ. On the other hand, we've allowed JR Green Windows throughout the nation to be able to handle tickets for today, which means, there may be a family who would say, hey, today's a nice sunny weather, let's go to USJ. And the screen that you see in front of you actually shows the map of Kinki region, where people would go to their nearby green windows and ask for a ticket for a certain date. They're prepared to go to USJ. And because the Green Window system is directly connected to Universal Studios Japan's server, they'll be able to say, this day is already filled or this day is vacant. In which case, those green windows will serve for the attendees to be the satellite to measure whether their optional dates are acceptable or not.
Right, so, and in 1998, right, before kind of the internet and things like that, this was a time that before I drove 4 hours from my hometown to USJ, that maybe it was full. This was also providing the customers a sense of safety, that they only had to go to kind of their next, JR window, wherever that was, and then they could check, okay, is this a good day to go to USJ or not?
Right. Japanese are very stringent with regulations, and the Fire Service Act at that point, I don't know what it is now, but they've limited the real-time attendees to be somewhere around 55,000 is what I recall. So you couldn't sell your tickets more than a certain point. So USJ server obviously had to control that for advanced ticket sales as well as on-the-day tickets.
Right.
So now, going back to the attendees' perspective, why would they go to JR rather than going to the nearby travel agencies? We needed to have some kind of an advantage of people going to JR. And what we thought about is this seamless ticketing experience. Right. If you go to Japan Railways Green Windows and buy a bullet train ticket, you notice that it's a ticket with magnetic stripe on the back.
Correct.
Right? So they'll be able to record information on that ticket, and we've kind of focused on that. So whomever that bought the tickets, the passport from JR's Green Windows, they were able to go straight to the turnstile gate, which in turn exchanged those JR tickets to a visualized universal themed passports with characters and whatnot. So, but if you go to travel agencies, normally an orthodox approach they would do would be to sell passports with a voucher, in which case you had to queue online at ticket booth once, exchange that for a passport, and then queue again on a turnstile gate. So you needed to queue twice if you go and buy tickets from travel agencies. So that was a big advantage for JR, and they've done a great job advertising the seamless ticketing experience.
And then what were the results? We're now looking at a map that seems that you had, that highlights the success of the project.
Right, because of the close relationship we were able to develop with the JR group, Universal's creative team was really generous enough to grant the license usage of Universal characters to be designed on JR loop line trains. The photo you see on the left-hand top there is the actual train that ran on JR loop line in Osaka. So for the attendees, at the point they board JR trains, that's the point in time where the Universal experience started.
Begins, exactly.
And, see, so they were able to go to USJ, riding on those decorated trains. They go to Universal City Station, designed by Tadao Ando, the famous designer. They could go and walk through the Universal City Walk right up to the gate of USJ. So that was one big Universal experience, and they'd be able to motivate themselves to enjoy as soon as they enter the gate. So going back to the marathon versus sprint, it's really about the big goal that was set for the Japanese employees in Osaka as against to this sprint tactics that was really duly discussed and negotiated with the Universal to determine how we go forward with the third-party companies. So there was really a roles and responsibilities and the priorities and the detailed tactics to go with it. But as soon as we kind of determine how we go about doing what we're supposed to do, it was really a smooth ride.
What for you, having an understanding obviously of both sides, the Universal Studio sides, but then also the Japanese side, what do you think was for you those bridging characteristics that you felt that you could really bring to the team? Like, was there any moments where you did you find yourself saying to the Japanese, don't worry too much and let's move it, or were you saying to the Americans, look, this is what you need to understand about the Japanese? Did you find yourself playing that bridge role in this project?
I did. One thing you have to be certain of, it kind of goes back to my previous story about I don't know what percentage of myself is Japanese as against the Westerners.
Right.
You cannot criticize the Americans within the Japanese community, and you can't do the opposite to the American community. And that's really all about doing this cross-border projects together. So you have to work together, have them understand what the other cultures are thinking, and have them on board to execute. And for a person that's playing the intermediate role, that's a huge hassle. So it'd be great if the participants would understand the hurdle that intermediate person is going through and understand how he or she is feeling about playing that role.
Right, and it's sometimes exhausting, right? Because you not only have your job in front of you, the actual job that you're doing, but you kind of have this second full-time job, which is managing, everyone's expectations as well. But we've seen that was one case with the Universal Studios, and that was that kind of cross-cultural experience. And then we have another experience of yours about managing mid to long-term initiatives and those immediate results. Again, in the context of banking. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about where you were, what was going on in the second project?
Yes. Now, right after I worked for Sanwa Bank, which eventually turned into USJ and worked there for 13 years, I transferred myself to Bandai, Japan's biggest toy company. And at the point I joined the company, they were facing this rather awkward situation where a Western activist fund was visiting them in an average once a month. They buy the shares of Bandai because it was a public company, and they would submit this statement of large volume holdings to Kanto Finance Bureau, and they repeatedly done that. And it was very uncomfortable for Bandai, whose board members, had this career trajectory of making toys.
Okay.
They made molds, they designed toys, and they promoted the sales of those toys. So for those people to be working for a public company, I wouldn't say it was a hostile takeover, but
it was a lot of stress to manage, obviously.
Right, an activist fund from London to buy their shares and be, receiving all these management proposals to enhance their market cap. It was really a challenging moment for them. So they had to think of a way to exit that situation.
Right.
And it was the time that Square Enix merged in April 2003, Sega Sammy merged in October 2004, and Konami acquired Hudson, another game company, in April 2005, when I was there at Bandai, being told to merge with another company in order to increase the market cap.
Okay.
So that was the time we've knocked on the door of Namco and asked for a management integration of the two, because Namco obviously had their problems and Bandai had their problems. So it was the merger of the two entertainment companies, Bandai being a toy company, Namco being a game company. It was really a perfect fit because Bandai's video gaming division outsourced the development to a third party. But if we were able to merge with Namco, we were able to have an internal resource to develop games for the characters that Bandai was responsible of.
Right, and then to be able to do it in-house, then obviously have other innovation opportunities and, partnerships with, and then we have Bandai who are then able to then, create the characters or to build toys around it. Because as we know, the Japanese digital life and gaming is very much flows into real life, and you'll see, any kind of digital character who might be popular at the time, be it Pikachu or anybody else, that they really do love these characters, and you see them on the toy stores and you see them on the shelves, and people do buy them and they bring them into their homes really as part of their family. So then we had...
Right. So, for Silchester International Investors, the fund that was approaching Bandai, they were previously dealing with a company with a market cap of 250 billion yen. But after the merger with Namco, they had to deal with a company, a Bandai Namco group, that had market cap of 400 billion. So for a company that's in a country where we don't have Delaware, state laws allowing us to have poison ivy and golden parachutes and whatnot, merging with another company to enhance the market cap was one way to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm. Against what? When you say defense?
The activist fund buying the shares and having a substantial amount of portion of the outstanding shares, enabling them to have the rights as a shareholder to say things to the board members.
Right.
If you were to have 51% or more of a public company, you'll be able to actually select who is going to be the board member of that company.
Right. And I find this is a common story in Japan, where people will see let's say a business move as nationalistic, as protectionist in one sense. And then on the other hand, you'll see people saying, well, it's really got to do with the fact that this company is operating, with different values.
Correct. Very similar to Bandai Namco's situation. Recently, this is right in 2020, but an activist fund called Third Point had purchased the shares of Sony and made a lot of proposals. Mm-hmm. And the same was done by independent franchise partners toward Kirin.
Right.
And I see them to be, this may sound very negative, but it was really short-sighted in the sense that the two activist funds both asked to sell non-core businesses to Sony and Kirin and enrich the internal reserves subsequent to executing stock buybacks. So, which means that it didn't change the market cap, but because the outstanding shares would be reduced, the stock price would go up.
Right. And in your opinion, what would have been
gain for the funds?
And then what would have been then in your opinion the alternative? What would you have recommended them to do? To wait?
Well, the Japanese public companies will really have to think about how they would go about with the investor relations from now on.
Yeah.
Now that we have, sustainable development goals to accomplish for each of the companies, not just public but private as well, you need to have a long-term goals. You have to make decision based on those long-term goals and not, short-term desires. And desires would be, proposed by those funds because they want to make capital gains instantly. But that's not the case with the public companies or the people that are running those public companies. So I would have to think that refining strategies for investor relations to address their ownership of the shares to be mid to long term instead of short term.
Yeah.
The companies would have to develop their mid to long term strategies, explain why those strategies are important, invite potential investors that are willing to hold mid to long term, and the public companies will be obligated to explain the progress every quarter as they announce their financials, and develop a transparent relationship with their shareholders.
And one thing that you also mentioned, particularly in this setting of the Bandai Namco relationship, is that when we do have a merger, you don't, you have company A and you have company B. You don't have company A plus B. You actually have a new company. You have company C, right? Because you have people who didn't used to communicate or didn't used to know each other, now communicating. So you actually build this completely new network. And so doing things like, employee training and, building culture, but also not only company culture, but also cross-functional communication is so important. Is that something that you suggested, or was that something that you led, or how did that work?
I think you're talking about post-merger integration.
Right.
Not just within those group companies, but with the corporate, business partners as well. Right. It is something that you have to undergo. In some cases, you have to turn around a business because that particular company needs to survive, and etc. That would be something that would be discussed just within the Japanese colleagues, but you have to really determine black and white, whether this company is going to be liquidated, whether this company is going to be turned around, whether this company is going to be enhanced with the present status. That's something that will need to be duly discussed. But I would have to say it's a lot easier than working with the Westerners.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we talk about culture, often we think it's kind of international culture, national culture, Japanese versus Western. But there's just as much culture, particularly in a Japanese company, because Japanese companies don't simply function like a Western company, i.e. you come to work, you do your job, and you go home. Japanese companies do tend to build this ecosystem of culture. I know that when people introduce themselves, even if they're a consultant, they'll say, I'm, blah, blah, this, like they'll say, it's interesting in Japanese, they'll use the Japanese, like they use the company name and then your name. So you'll say almost like I'm, insert company's name here, Tanaka, or something like this. And this I found really interesting. And there's also this reference to culture being, I've seen people say that to use the word shushin, and shushin meaning hometown, meaning origin, as company. So you'll meet someone, let's say that they're working at IBM, and they'll say, but maybe Microsoft Shushin. That's where they came from. And I found that also very interesting, that this culture that we talk of specifically in corporate Japan is not only country culture, but it's certainly company culture as well. So speaking about turnarounds, and the last case, which is that you turned around the Namco's US subsidiary company. So obviously you were responsible of the Bandai and Namco relationship, and then now you were sent to the US.
That's correct. I went to Chicago, and I was there for about 2 years to turn around a chronically deficit amusement coin operations that Namco had. And it was a challenging task. And I kind of, just on a bullet point basis, jot down the situation at the point I paid a visit, which was early 2008. There were nearly 1,300 unmanned amusement coin operation locations, 70 plus manned locations, 920 employees, half of which were full-time, 30 district managers, 150 route managers, and 70 plus store managers, 24,000 game machines, most of which were video games, a dozen warehouses throughout the United States, and they were making, constantly a revenue range of somewhere between $80 and $100 million a year. US, but the earnings before interest were chronically deficit. So they're making tons of revenues, but they're not making money.
Right.
So, the situation I had witnessed was that the employees were impoverished, and they were sick of being micromanaged by the Japanese parent company in Tokyo.
You mean impoverished emotionally?
Emotionally.
Yeah.
Because Japanese would micromanage and ask what the situation is, but they never propose solutions because they don't know what's going on in the United States.
Right. Or understand the context. So they're asking, they're only seeing, the results, and they're not seeing the bigger picture as to why that is. So
right.
You turn up, I can imagine you probably had a little bit of pushback from the US subsidiary, right? So because their experience, generally with working with the Japanese company, with the Japanese headquarter, wasn't positive. And then so you turn up from the headquarters. How do you go about implementing a turnaround plan?
It was really similar to USJ, but you really have to blend into those people and say that, you don't represent Japan or the parent company, but, I'm here to work together with my American colleagues to turn this business around.
Right.
So I would imagine that some of my colleagues felt uncomfortable with that, but, it didn't take a while to really blend in because, again, this is my subjective view, and my colleagues in those days might oppose to what I'm about to say, but I think I've duly discussed how to turn around the company with the people that were working for that subsidiary in the United States.
Right.
We came up with 4 big plans. One was the recovery transformations, how to increase the revenue and cut costs. We've discussed about enhancing efficiencies. We've also discussed about how we would train the employees, and we've also talked about the new attempts to maintain motivation toward the company they work for.
Okay.
And of the recovery transformation, when you think about coin operation, it's the game centers, the game amusement arcades that we're talking about. And the 4 big expenditures of operating a coin-based amusement arcade is the leasing fee, it's the labor costs, and it's the depreciation associated with the game machines and the prizes that are in the crane machines. These are the 4 big expenditures for the business. And what we've done is we've constantly monitored our executions and how about we were going with the KPI that we've set. So the graph shows you that we've done what we're supposed to do, right. And we've eliminated all the people and made sense as to which stores to close and negotiated the penalty fees for early terminations and whatnot. So
that's obviously
there was always a reason.
In the US than it is in Japan.
Pardon?
That's obviously a little bit easier than in the US than in Japan.
Yes. So when actually the activities started moving, I was able to delegate those projects to the managers and above, and he or she be able to actually execute those initiatives by himself, herself, and accomplish the goals. So it was quite comfortable and enjoyable, but we worked like hell.
But then also these opportunities came with them building trust in you, that you have trust in them. When you started outsourcing work, when you invited them to participate and you encouraged their efforts, they really started to see, okay, now that our Japanese parent company is really listening to us and is trusting us. And I can imagine that incorporating that team into the rollout is incredibly important. And I think maybe things like your ability to connect both cultures were really valuable at that point. What did the employees say during the process? What was kind of their view?
I weighed importance on consensus management. So I wanted the employees of this subsidiary to think for themselves, act for themselves, and work together, as opposed to being told what to do. So they were motivated. They understand the meaning of each of the actions they had to take. So I felt quite comfortable working with those people, and I hope they would too. We are still friends after all these years.
Yeah, so, this is something that I love. This is for me very much a Japanese story, the ability to hold the relationship post the project.
But consensus management is a simple 2 words, but it is so difficult, challenging for the Japanese to accomplish with the Western people. And the reason is quite simple, because they need a language skill to do so, and they need to understand the culture associated with it, and they need to blend into their community, and mutually understand each other. And that position is quite challenging for Japanese to accomplish.
Yeah.
Going back to the slide, if I can explain page 20 a little. This explains the situation of the route managers in the districts that covered. And you can see that from April 2008, we've kind of concentrated our resources to the east side of Mississippi River, so that one route manager be able to visit a lot of unmanned locations in a day. So their activities became more efficient. And on the right, it shows the 5 locations where the warehouses are located at the end, whereas we had dozens of locations before, but it was integrated into these 5 locations where it only served to maintenance the games, where each of the 5 locations had designated service person. Right. So that kind of made things a lot more efficient. And we've also done a lot of employee training programs for the people to understand what it means to understand the depreciation of each of the games. So because we had so many warehouses, and the route managers, district managers, they all ignored the book values of those game machines, so they didn't understand what depreciation was. But if you would understand the revenue of a game and the lifetime of the depreciation, and be able to divide that value into that period, then they could understand what percentage of depreciation has to I'm sorry. They could understand what portion of the depreciation would have to serve as, for example, 5% of the revenues that needs to be aimed by that particular game.
Right.
We also done a lot of qualitative education. If you were to have Blu-rays and DVDs, displayed on a game called Movie Stock, and if that game was to be positioned at one of the exits of Walmart, you don't want restricted games for children to be displayed at a Walmart. So it's a simple thing, but these kind of quantitative and qualitative trainings kind of enhance the quality of the service toward our corporate clients as well.
Right.
And at the very end, the new attempts that we've done, very interesting one was we've converted a Japanese pachinko machine into a redemption game where the tickets are outputted toward the winners, and that in turn could be exchanged at a redemption center for sets of toys and whatnot. We've also applied Japanese crane prizes, which was quite different to the American employees. It was very refreshing. It was very distinctive. It kind of changed Namco's locations from the others. These were kind of quite exciting attempts that no one had done before my arrival. So that was another interesting thing that we've done together.
And I think that there's so much really that we've seen over these three cases, that we've seen how you've been able to utilize or to leverage parts of the Japanese culture, but also parts of Western culture to really bring about, change and innovation without losing what I often see as the core of the Japanese organization. And I'm sure many people will disagree with me, but I still think that the people element of a Japanese company is still so very strong. They are very concerned with their people. Obviously know that there's issues in terms of management, and we have to work on, getting employees to speak up. But the idea that an employee, is cared for is very much the case. So if we take this and we wrap it up and we look to the future, we use the moment that we're now in. I don't know if we've actually mentioned it, but obviously we're in the period of the COVID period, COVID-19. So we spoke about issues pre-COVID and post-COVID. So maybe you want to share a little bit about your thoughts, how, a traditional Japanese company would have acted before COVID, and then now with this really wave that completely changed the world, maybe the opportunity.
Okay. Japanese are basically allergic to change. And I think it's evident that we all understand that. And they're very conservative. They're also introverted. They look inside rather than outside. And we also have to understand that the Japanese history dates back to 660 BC, which means their history is 2,680 years old. Out of the 200 plus years old companies in the world, which counts to 5,586 over 41 countries, 56% were in Japan.
Right.
And that's quite a number. So, when you kind of ask for Japanese to change, I don't think they would say this out loud, but they're quite confident about the sustainability that the Japanese understand. Mm-hmm. And so they were quite confident, and they don't show that confidence, but it was quite challenging for a lot of Westerners to persuade Japan to change, mm-hmm. and which is so many articles written about this. Mm-hmm. But post-COVID-19, we had an iconic kind of interesting event that triggered them to reconsider their thoughts. Mm-hmm. And it was an unfortunate event, but a company called Kobikicho Benmatsu, which was a obento company that was right in Higashi Ginza, in front of Kabukiza, decided to liquidate the business after 152 years.
Wow.
Okay. And there was another company, a pickle company called Maruhachi Yatarazuke, which also decided to liquidate the business after 135 years up in Yamagata.
Do we
So
know why?
these two events were very iconic for many Japanese, that COVID-19 had, pressured those two businesses to shut down.
Right.
And, this is something that was really serious in the commercial world. We really have to think about digitally transforming ourselves to survive this state, which was something that we've never experienced before.
Right. And many people would say that obviously COVID-19 wasn't responsible. If anything, it was the catalyst of certain companies not, changing. And I've had an experience working with a Japanese company that was actually 400 years old. And what I found was definitely what you mentioned. There's that we respect our tradition, we respect the decisions that have brought us here, that have kept us profitable for 400 years. But at the same time, there is definitely this kind of need for not, kind of this radical transformation, but they do recognize that we want to take what made us great in the past, our values, we want to bring those forward, but at the same time, we want to move forward.
Yeah, there's a lot of contradictions, and it's something we've never experienced before. And based on the mentality of the Japanese, they hate to try something new, but it's something that we have to go through. And one thing I think that the Westerners would have to understand is don't be superficial, but understand their situations in depth. Like we've done with the USJ's negotiations with JR and how the relationship works within the group company. So I see so many Westerners saying Japanese are hard to go digital because they have Hanko culture of the seal choppings of the world, and that's really the case, but it's very superficial in the sense that Westerners would have to understand how those Hanko seals are being used. Like for many textile, steel, and construction companies, they revolve the promissory notes using those Hankos, but that itself is forming their cash flow practice. And if one goes bankrupt, then there's going to be a chain reaction of bankruptcies. And that's deriving from the Hanko seal chopping culture, but you have to change the cash flow practice at the same time in order to resolve the issue.
Right. It's not as easy as, okay, let's just go digital.
Right. So
what other
it's easy to say that Japan needs to go teleworking and work from home, work from satellite offices and whatnot, and have the employees meet a circumstance that they don't have to physically visit their offices. But it's really those in-depth situations, the circumstances that the Western people need to understand and be able to cooperate and propose resolutions to fix those problems.
And it really just comes back down to having that, being able to take a step back, and instead of just criticizing or being, offering solutions, to take a step back and first ask why, and to take the time to understand.
That's right. And if you mutually share the problems and duly discuss how to overcome them, the step-by-step process will be kaizen for the Japanese, the improving transition for the Japanese rather than change.
Exactly.
And the ultimate change will be the teleworking environment, but there's bits and pieces of tactics that's required to meet that goal. And it's really the in-depth discussions that you need to have cross-border.
Akio, we've been so lucky to have so much of your time and to hear so many of your experiences. So as we wrap up, what's your hope? What's your hope post COVID-19?
A lot of people have been saying this for decades and decades, but Japan is facing a serious population decline. Our domestic market is shrinking. We have to go global. The companies have the internal reserves, and they superficially buy companies outside the country, but they fail to do so. So over and over again, the auditors are telling the companies to execute huge impairments for the goodwill of those companies that were purchased outside Japan. I think we needed to learn a lesson that Japanese would have to go global one way or the other, and they would have to understand the language as well as the culture to be a global player. It's an orthodox resolution, but that's the only way to go. And Japan will need to rethink about, improve the current education system, because this is not really about the spelling or the grammar or the reading and writing and whatnot, but it's about the debate and finding the intelligence in a Western way where the market is. So I would hope that even a portion of the people listening to this would understand the situation and enhance the third largest economy in the world to stay in that position, or maybe enhance in the future.
Right, and they can be sure that there's consultants and there's people that can guide them through this process, and you're certainly one of them, and we'll make sure that if anyone has any questions or wants to reach out to you after the episode, that they certainly can do so. So Akio, with that, I wanted to say thank you so much, and we'll have to have you back on the show again, and then next time we'll talk about education.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Brittany.